Hey guys, here we are for chapter 15. We're going to talk about food and food production. Chapter 15, section 1, we're going to talk about feeding the world. What does it take to feed a hungry world? Your essential question, what is the importance of the Green Revolution? We'll talk about that towards the end of the section, but something to think about as we move through today's work. So, feeding the world. Well, let's start right off the bat with famine. What happens when we can't? Now, famine is just widespread malnutrition in an area specifically because of a shortage of food. Now, usually this is caused by some catastrophic event, and drought being the most common one. Not enough rain, therefore the crops won't grow. Can be war, there can be other reasons for famine, but largely some sort of drought, flood, something has gotten rid of the crops. Now, today's modern agricultural practices provide most of the world's population with enough food to survive. However, some of these modern practices can actually cause environmental damage that makes growing the food crops more difficult. Some of these things are simply desertification. If we use up all the nutrients in the soil, then the plants can't grow. We sometimes get salinization. The constant irrigating and fertilizing can cause the soil to get salty. There's lots of various things that go on. Usually when we do it well, it's okay, but the practices can be harmful. Now let's talk about humans and nutrition. Now the human body uses food as both a source of energy, so I can talk and walk and move around and go ride my bike, all this stuff, and also as the raw building materials to maintain our body tissues, like I get a cut and it grows back. Or most of you guys are still growing and developing, so it's the raw materials for you to get bigger and grow muscles, all that stuff. Now the amount of energy that is available in food is expressed in calories. 1 calorie, capital C, is actually equivalent to 1,000 little c calories. Now normally when you're looking on the back of a food product and it says calories, it's actually talking about kilocalories, capital C. Like an individual Cheerio can have like 100 calories, little c. So normally we talk about kilocalories, 1,000 calories. The major nutrients that we get from food are going to be carbohydrates, protein, and fats. You sit down and you eat a meal and it's going to have some of all of those. Usually your highest percentage is going to be carbohydrates, somewhere in the 60 to 70%. Then you're going to have 20% protein, and then maybe 10 to 15% fat. Once again, it all depends on what you're eating. You could have a really heavy protein and fat, but as a general rule, somewhere around there. Now, everybody needs those 3, what we call macronutrients, and we also need a lot of micronutrients, some of the vitamins and minerals to keep us healthy. You don't get enough vitamin C, you can get rickets. You don't get enough iodine, you can develop a goiter or actually lead towards mental retardation. It causes your brain to not be able to function properly. So we have to get the macronutrients, carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, and we need to get the micronutrients like vitamins and minerals. And this takes us to malnutrition. Now, malnutrition is a disorder of nutrition that results when a person does not get enough of each of the nutrients needed by the human body. Now we have malnutrition and undernutrition. Undernutrition is when somebody is just not getting enough calories. They might be getting a right mix, but they're just getting way too few. Let's say you need 1,500 calories a day, and this person's getting 900 a day. It's just not enough food. But usually when we talk about malnutrition, you're not getting something. Lots of different forms of it. For example, humans have to get 8 essential amino acids from their proteins. And it's easily done with a variety of food. But for instance, like corn may have 6 of the amino acids. And if you eat corn with some beans, then you get all 8. Or rice might have 5 of them, and you eat rice and beans, and you get all 8. So the 8 are not in everything, but if you're eating a variety of foods, then you tend to get all of these amino acids that you need from proteins. However, in many parts of the world, the only sources of food may actually just be corn primarily or rice primarily. And they do contain protein. You can eat enough and get the protein that you need, but they do lack some of these amino acids. And if you're not getting all 8 of them, then you can get amino acid deficiency, and this can result from this type of limited diet. Even in somewhere in America where you really get enough, sometimes if you're really just getting something as, say, you're trying to go for a walk and you're just feeling exhausted all the time, it might be a lack of protein. People who eat vegetarian diets have to be careful to make sure they do eat a wide variety and get all of the amino acids, what we call a complete protein. Now, if you eat meat, the meat has all of the 8 amino, because it's animal, right? It's already had to grow and develop them, or had to get them for it to grow and develop. So if you eat meat, you get all of the essential. But if you're not eating meat in a diet, you have to eat a variety of foods to make sure you get all of them. When we talk about diet, diet is just that. It's the amount and type of food a person eats. Somebody says, ooh, what's your diet? It means, what do you normally eat? My diet, we normally eat a lot of grains and fresh vegetables. We cook our own food, and we tend to eat a lot of fresh vegetables with what we eat. And I eat sort of small amounts of meat, but my daughter eats no meat. She is vegetarian. So when we talk about a diet, it's not that you have to be on the South Beach diet or the Atkins or whatever the famous diet at the moment is. It's just, what do you eat? In Nepal, we tend to eat rice and beans. In Asia, they tend to eat a lot of rice and vegetables. In Africa, they eat a lot of corn and yams. What's your diet? A healthy diet is simply one that maintains the balance of the right amount of nutrients, minerals, and vitamins. As long as you're getting the nutrients you need and the vitamins and minerals you need, it's a healthy diet. Now, the foods produced in the greatest amounts worldwide are actually grains. They're plants of the grass family. Talk about wheat and corn and rice and barley and milk. These are actually just grasses. We've just developed them, domesticated them, so that we use them for food. But this is just the main source of food around the planet. And besides eating of the grains, most people eat fruits, vegetables, and then typically smaller amounts of meats, nuts, and other foods that can be very rich in fats and proteins. Once again, we need to get a balance of all of it, not too much really of one or the other. Now, people worldwide generally consume the same major nutrients, and really we're eating the same basic kinds of food. They might prepare theirs a little different here. They may put a different type of seasoning over there, but for the most part, we're eating corn, rice, potatoes as our main starch, and wheat with bread, our main starch elements, and then we're eating whatever vegetables are growing, whether it's broccoli or celery or rice or carrots, and anyway, you get the idea. So our diets kind of vary by region, but it's really filled with a lot of the same types of food. Some areas have more availability for fresh vegetables and some for fruits, nuts, what have you. Now, people in more developed countries like the United States, Canada, England, France, Spain, Norway, most of Europe, tend to eat more food and larger portions of proteins and fat than people in less developed countries. We're more affluent, we have more money, and we tend to eat foods that are higher up the food chain, if you will, right? We're not just eating the plants, we're eating things that are eating the plants and we're eating them. So more like a secondary or tertiary consumer. The developed world tends to eat higher up the food chain than the less developed world. Now, as the population grows, farmland tends to replace forest and grasslands. And this is just, if you will, the ecology of food. So feeding everyone in the world while maintaining natural ecosystems becomes increasingly difficult. We're right at 8 billion people on the planet right now, with more people being born every day. There's more people being born than there are dying every day, so the population's rising, right? Well, every person out there needs food, and we need to develop more farmland. And a lot of time developing farmland is either replacing grassland or forest land with cropland, somewhere that we can grow food. And different kinds of agriculture tend to have different kinds of environmental impacts and different levels of efficiency. Not everything has the same kind of crop yield. In other words, like in an acre of land, the name of the game is how many pounds of food or how many calories can I produce on an acre of land. In some foods, I can produce more calories in an acre of land than others. So it's a matter of growing enough food for a very hungry world. So we can talk about this in terms of food efficiency. So the efficiency of any given type of agriculture is a measure of the quantity of food produced on a given area of land with limited input of energy and resources. In other words, how much labor does it take to put into it? If I'm having to use a lot of fertilizers and a lot of water and a lot of labor to get, it might be very labor intensive, so I'm kind of putting more energy in than I'm getting out. So an ideal food crop is one that efficiently produces a large amount of food with very little negative impact on the environment. And these are the kind of foods that we tend to go after. On average, more energy, water, and land are used to produce a calorie of food from animals than to produce a calorie of food from plants. So in other words, I have a cow farm. It takes more food and energy to create a pound of cow than it does to create a pound of corn or wheat. So animals that are used for human use are typically fed plant matter because less energy is available at each level as we go up the food chain. Remember, only about 10% makes it from the grain into the cow, and then we eat the cow, and only 10% is making it from the cow into us. So if we're taking grain and feeding the cow, and then you and I are eating the cow, we would have got a lot more calories by just eating the grain. And this is what happens in a lot of the less developed countries. It is much more efficient to just eat the grain than to eat the meat because you lose so much efficiency along the way. So a given area of land can produce more food for humans if we grow plants than raising animals. And the efficiency of raising plants for food is one reason why diets around the world are largely based on plants. And a lot of times it comes down to levels of poverty. Meat is much more expensive as well. A pound of meat, let's say, a pound of ground beef may run for, in the United States, $3 to $5 a pound, depending on where you're at. And if I go buy like a piece of steak, it can be like $10 to $20 a pound. Whereas if I go buy a pound of corn, that might cost me $1 at the grocery store. Much cheaper to buy a pound of corn than it is to buy a pound of meat. However, meat from animals generally provides more nutrients per gram than the food from the plants. Ideally, we eat a mixture of this. Small amounts of meat can really help get all the vitamins and minerals that you need because kilogram per kilogram, there's more nutrients. The meat is denser calorically and minerals and vitamins than the grain. So there's benefit to both. Now, let's go and let's talk about old versus new foods. Now, researchers are really trying to improve the efficiency of food production. Once again, I have an acre of land. I want to grow as many pounds of food possible on that acre of land, and it's what we call yield. The amount of crops per unit of area. What is my crop yield? The more food I can grow in a single acre of crop, the better off it is. It can feed more people and it doesn't take up as much land. Because once again, there's only so much land out there and not all of it is actually good for growing plants. So we need to get as much food as possible out of the land that grows it. We're trying to increase our food yields as much as possible. Because right now, the world food problems that we're looking at. Some people become malnourished simply because they're not getting enough food. And this is technically undernutrition when you're just not getting enough food, a type of malnutrition. And obviously more food is needed each year in order to feed a growing population. It's kind of like you're a growing family. You know, there were 3 of you, now there's 4 of you, then there's 5 of you. Well, it takes more food to feed the 5 of you than when there were 3 of you. You know, pretty simple stuff. World food production has been increasing for decades. We've been getting higher yields off and we've been growing more and more food. It's just that right now, the food production is not increasing as fast as the human population is increasing. We're striving to try and grow more and more food. It's just the population is outstripping our ability to grow food. And there's unequal distribution. Everywhere isn't getting the same amount, if you were. And if we took all the food in the world today, we took all the food and it was all divided up evenly and everybody just got a fair share, no one would really quite have enough for good health. All of us would be malnourished in some level. Not quite enough calories or not enough vitamins or minerals. There's simply not enough food out there for everyone. But what's happening right now, many of us have food and other people simply do not. And the reason for this, by and large, is poverty. Malnutrition is largely a result of poverty. Even here in the United States, there are many poor people that suffer from malnutrition. They can't afford to buy the food. Poverty is the root of malnutrition around the world, and it's the root that we need to solve, if you will. We need to try and address poverty, because when we address poverty, we actually help a whole host of other things. Now, wars and political strife lead to malnutrition as well, because they can interrupt transportation systems. There's food over here, we wanted to get to them, but there's a war zone right here, and we can't safely get the food from here. Or you get a political regime and this person says, I am going to protect my people, but we're not going to give any food to those people. So even though we have food and we want to give it to them, the person in power here says we have to give the food to him and he will distribute it to the people, but he's not going to distribute it to all the people equally. So it's not always simply because of poverty. It's just poverty is by far the biggest reason why. And this can take us to droughts and famines. Just once again, poverty is the main reason because it happens everywhere, even if there isn't political strife or if there isn't war or even if there isn't a drought or famine. But drought and famine is another one that occurs. Now a drought is just we go without rain for prolonged periods of time. The rainfall is way below average. So if you're relying on rain to water your crops or you're relying on the river to water your crops and the river is so low you can't get water out of it, then the crop yields start to suffer. They can't grow as much. The plants get stunted, everything's smaller, and you just don't have as much of your crop yield again. We were expecting to get 500 kilograms of food and we got 100 kilograms of food. Well, we're feeding a lot less people with it. Now, a drought is more likely to cause famine in places where the food's grown locally. A lot of times we're relying on the farm down there for our food. We're relying on our farm for our food. And drought hits these places more than likely. In the United States, we ship our food in from all over. So if one region is experiencing drought or famine-like conditions, we don't have a famine because we ship food in a lot. But if you're in an area that you're relying on the food grown right here, it can be a problem. And when a drought occurs, there may not be any seed to plant crops the following year. Normally we hold seed back to plant, but if people are starving to death, you eat it, and then the next year you don't have seed to plant and you can't grow food. And the effects of a drought can actually continue for years and years. A lot of times it takes other countries and people going in to provide aid and help, to provide the feed and the seed for them to get through it. Now, people in a given area can usually survive one crop failure. They've saved some food, we've reserved some grain, this is the thing, we're going to plant it, but we can't eat it. You can survive one crop failure. But several years of drought can cause severe famine, because when you're losing crop after crop after crop for several years, it's really bad. And then the soil becomes less able to support the production of food because nothing's grown in it, nothing's died in it, and the nutrients in the soil like nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium, which are desperately needed by the plants, leach out of the soil from the rains and the topsoil erodes. So famines and droughts can really be horrific because even when they're done, then you can't grow food like you used to be able to, and it takes a long time to recover. And this takes us to the Green Revolution. Now, worldwide, starting in around the 50s, but really between the 50s and 70s, we had dramatic increases in crop yields. Basically, scientists got involved in the farming. Not that farmers didn't know what they were doing, but we came in and kind of studied and looked at it and realized, okay, if we provide this much fertilizer and we spray with pesticides and we use this much water, it's the amount of water that the plants absolutely need, we can get the biggest, best corn, tomato, whatever that you can have. So we started using, and also we began using new crop varieties. These tomatoes grow faster than those. These corn will grow larger than that corn. So we started identifying specific varieties of food and then kind of came up with a formula for how to grow them. And these changes were called the Green Revolution. And since the 1950s, the Green Revolution has changed the lives of millions of people because it has seriously upped our crop yields, more food per acre, which is the name of the game. However, as is with almost anything, there's a trade-off that's had some negative effects as well. Most of the new varieties and the Green Revolutions that you got to grow this corn or that tomato or that wheat or this rice, certain varieties, they only produce these better yields if they get the large amounts of water, fertilizer, and pesticides. And if you miss any of those, they don't give as good a yield. So it's kind of like I could use my traditional one, I'm going to make up numbers, and I would get 500 pounds of food off of my corn. But if I use the Green Revolution, I could get 750 pounds of corn. The problem is if I didn't follow the formula just right, I didn't water enough, or I didn't get fertilizer, instead of getting my normal 500, I only got 200. So I could get 750, but it was kind of like all or nothing. And a lot of people just didn't have the equipment necessary because it required tractors, you had to have irrigation, you had to be able to buy the pesticides and fertilizers, so it was a little more expensive. You had to have all the machinery, the irrigation in place, and all of these things actually can degrade the soil. When we turn over the soil and I expose everything before the plants begin to grow, soil can wash away. Adding the fertilizers, especially in drier climates, can lead to salinization. The soil gets salty. So, as a result of the overuse of these fertilizers, pesticides, etc., yields from the Green Revolution have started to fall. Grain production in the United States since the 1990s has decreased, partly because the amount of water for irrigation is decreased as well. Not as much there. So the Green Revolution has had a dramatic effect on us. Once again, from the 50s to the 70s, great. But at this point, we're beginning to see some diminishing returns because some of these same practices wind up leaching a lot of the materials out of soil. That's led to soil erosion. And it's also had a pretty negative effect on what we call subsistence farmers. Subsistence farmer is somebody who is farming to subsist, just growing enough to survive. And they're growing only enough food really for local use. Now, before the Green Revolution, subsistence farmers provided most of the world's farm. They were the ones out doing the farming. However, they couldn't afford the equipment, the water, the chemicals, etc. needed to grow these new crop varieties. So largely we've had a lot of corporations come in and take over this big agribusiness, if you will, these huge farms taking out and growing. And the subsistence farmers, if they couldn't afford all this, they wouldn't. Now we've come sort of full circle. In a lot of places we've realized, like growing the food organically and working the land, they can get crop yields very similar to our Green Revolution. So the green revolution seems to come to the point where we've done about as much as we can using the new varieties and the techniques of fertilizer. And once again, it all has its pluses and minuses. Guys, that wraps it up for today's chapter. Take care, and we'll see you next time.